All right, hey guys, this is Coach Bearline again, and we've ended World War II. Now we're going to move into a new phase, a new conflict that's called the Cold War. And basically, at the end of the Cold War, you have tension between the Soviet Union and the United States. And this is going to lead to basically a competition for more or less global domination between the two countries. So we're going to talk about what the roots of the Cold War today, what the Iron Curtain was and what it represented, how the U.S. responded to Soviet actions early on, and we're going to talk about the Berlin crisis and how it was resolved by the U.S. and Great Britain. All right, so the Cold War kind of had its roots in some basic differences between the U.S. and Soviet Union. Philosophical difference are the fact that the Soviet Union was a communist totalitarian dictatorship, and this is a fundamental difference from the United States, which is a free enterprise system, also known as capitalism, and a republican form of government. And we had been allies during World War II, and to some degree during World War I, but during World War II, but we were never really friendly. The U.S. and the Soviet Union. The Soviets wanted the British and the Americans to open a European front much earlier, but the Brits and the Americans instead decided to invade North Africa first. And Stalin distrusted the West, and he believed that the United States and the British were trying to weaken the Soviet Union intentionally. So there's already some bad blood there. And then when the United States uses the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it worries the Soviet Union obviously, because they are faced with this great weapon that the United States has used. All right, so at Yalta, the Soviet Union, Stalin had promised to allow Eastern European territories held by the Soviets to have elections, but at Potsdam, the Potsdam Conference, basically Stalin goes back on that. So the U.S. it really works hard to resist Soviet expansion, and we'll talk a little bit about the Truman Doctrine and that kind of thing in a minute. All right, so Stalin wanted to retain political and economic control over Eastern Europe. He wanted to do this because he believed that he needed a buffer zone between the countries of Western Europe and the Soviet Union because to defend against possible invasion. So he outlawed political parties in many of these countries in Eastern Europe, and the Soviets really cracked down and rigged elections to make sure that the communists took power. The one that wasn't under direct control of Stalin within a couple of years was Yugoslavia. And even though Yugoslavia wasn't under Soviet control, it was a communist dictatorship, but it was under the leadership of a gentleman by the name of Joseph Tito. And Tito was a very harsh dictator, but he didn't march through the orders of the Soviet Union. Everybody else pretty much did, though. All right, so Winston Churchill, in a speech in the United States, he went on tour of the United States, and he basically said that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe, and he blamed the Soviets for creating the divisions. And Truman agrees, and he urges his Secretary of State to get tough with Soviets. Now, on the other side, Soviets believed the Iron Curtain was necessary. They had to have the division to protect themselves from Western attacks. And he used Churchill's comments to basically convince his people that the U.S. and Great Britain were enemies and were out to get them. He also begins to rebuild the Soviet military, which in effect continues the arms race. So George Kennan, who was a member of who worked in the U.S. State's Department, he comes out with this idea for the president known as containment. And the idea of containment is, we're not going to attack the Soviets, we're not going to push them, but we need to fight against their expansion, because he believed that the communist system would fail if it couldn't expand and get more resources. So this included economic aid, economic sanctions against communist governments, aid to non-communist governments, and, if necessary, military force. So this becomes a key piece of the Truman Doctrine. And the Truman Doctrine is Truman's idea that the United States would help fight against communism and communist oppressors. And it's very quickly tested in Greece and Turkey. There's lots of communism is growing in popularity in those countries, and they're facing threats of a communist takeover. So Truman convinces Congress to send millions of dollars to those countries, hundreds of millions actually, to those countries to prevent communists from gaining power. An extension of this is the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan was a larger plan to help rebuild the countries of Western Europe, to create stable conditions. Because the idea is if a country is stable, it's more likely to be democratic. It's when economies suffer that communism and socialism gain popularity in this time. So 17 countries are going to receive over $13 billion in aid. And what it does, it builds very strong alliances for the United States throughout Western Europe. So the Marshall Plan is part of the Truman Doctrine. Containment influences the Truman Doctrine, and the Marshall Plan is part of that, him carrying out that doctrine. First real test of the Truman Doctrine is in Berlin. Basically, Berlin, much like the rest of Germany, had been divided into 4 occupation zones. And basically what happens is, in the east you have a communist city, in the west you have a democratic city. So basically what happens is Stalin decides he's going to blockade Berlin. So in June 48, the Soviet army blocks all road, rail, and river traffic into West Berlin, which cuts the residents off from food, energy, and other types of products that they need. But it still had airstrips. And what happens is British and American planes begin making air deliveries into West Berlin. And for months and months, they continue to, well, for really a year, they continue to fly supplies into West Berlin. So even though it's effectively cut off from the land around it, the United States is able to fly in. And Stalin, knowing he's outgunned by the United States, especially with the atomic bomb, doesn't want to start a war, so they can't really shoot down the planes. And so, the Soviet blockade is useless pretty much, and in May 1949, they basically call off the blockade. Now, it's after this that the United States, Canada, and Western Europe form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is an alliance basically to defend against communist aggression. So today, 26 countries belong to NATO, and actually it's probably bigger now. I have to check and see. All right, so you've got Berlin, you've got this crisis, and it's a problem because now the country's trying to return to some sense of normalcy, as Harding put it after World War I. So we're going to talk about the challenge of returning to peacetime life. What life is like in America after World War II, what happens in post-war politics, and how the U.S. and other countries try to build a better world. So one of the problems facing America after the war, we've been producing war goods for so long. Now the United States has to figure out how to reconvert its economy to produce other types of goods. You also have 12 million people returning to civilian life. They need jobs. A lot of times women who had filled those jobs after men left are forced to leave to give the returning veterans, jobs. But in 1944, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act was passed to help veterans make that transition back into civilian life. But what happens is, soldiers come home, the economy's still doing pretty good, they've got money saved up, and they get married, they start having kids, and they start buying stuff, so demand for consumer goods rises sharply. And this is going to drive the American economy going forward. Also, labor kind of flexes its muscles. During the war, it agreed not to strike and do things of that nature, so it starts kind of pushing for the reforms that it wanted during the war. And also returning African Americans, they've been fighting for democracy abroad, and now they come back and they're seeing the discrimination at home, so they're going to start agitating for better opportunities as well. All right, so one of the main aspects of the Servicemen's Readjustment Act was the GI Bill. And this bill helped veterans transition to civilian life because it provided money for veterans to go to college or get job training. It provided money for loans for homes, farms, small businesses, all of these kinds of things. And really, the GI Bill may be the single most effective or the piece of legislation that probably changed America more than any other, because for the first time, millions of people are able to afford college, and that had never existed in the United States before. And again, you have all of these returning vets getting jobs, making money. They've got money saved up. They've got the GI Bill. They're able to build houses and things of that nature. So demand for consumer goods goes through the roof. Furniture and appliances become in great demand. And also, obviously these servicemen return home. They marry their sweethearts, and they do what husbands and wives will do, and you have a baby boom. From 1945 to 1960, you have the largest increase in American population in history. All right. Also, during the war or after the war, labor unions kind of say, okay, look, we were quiet during the war. We want our payback. So almost immediately after the war ends, the number of strikes rise very quickly. And in 1947, a Republican Congress passed the Taft-Hartley Act, which Truman vetoed, but they overrode his veto. And this does greatly reduce the power of labor unions. For instance, it calls for a cooling off period. Also after the war, Truman issues Executive Order 9981, which basically integrates the armed forces. Blacks and not just blacks, but blacks and Hispanics and other minorities are no longer going to be forced to serve in separate units. And this is a big change in not just the military, but in American society as a whole. Because for the first time, blacks and whites in a lot of cases have interaction on an equal basis. So it really is going to be a huge driver of social change moving forward. Hispanic veterans joined together in the American GI Forum to try to get full benefits for Hispanics. So there's still a push towards more equal opportunity. All right, so Truman was not popular amongst a lot of Democrats. Plus, he was coming under attack from Republicans also. Inflation was on the rise because so many consumer goods were being sold and were in demand. And he loses the Congress to the Republicans. So Republicans gained a majority in Congress in 1946. It's going to make it difficult for him to get things done. However, his popularity continued to decline, and most people thought that he was going to be defeated by Dewey. But anyway, so he basically goes off on what's called a whistle-stop campaign across the country. And he talks about the fair deal, his idea for domestic programs. And he wins the election in a huge upset. So he beats Dewey in an upset victory. So after the war, people are trying to prevent war. World War I had happened, World War II happened, a very close proximity, and they're trying to avoid this from happening again. So one thing that's done is the establishment of the United Nations, much like the League of Nations, except the United States joins this time. And basically, it uses international organizations to promote economic, social, and social advancement for all people. It's all about, it focuses on guaranteeing human rights, respecting treaties and agreements, and promoting progress and freedom. So toward the end of improving human rights, the UN signs the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It does things like outlaw slavery, gives rights for education and safety and all those kinds of things. So it's an important document in the history of the world. Also, they established the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund to help struggling countries rebuild and build modern economies. So we'll talk about more about the Cold War in the next unit. See you guys.